I think if we can educate our kids well, then it's our best chance to have a better world.
And why do we still believe that we're the same person? Grown, you've matured, but you still are the same person. And sometimes I joke with students and I say, I did everything I could not to get a real job.
They bother me because I made the decision. But they're nothing that's ever going to put us on our knees.
Very early in my life, I realized that having access to knowledge was kind of a critical way. Happiness is not measured by a sign of dollars. It's measured by the level of liberty that you have.
As a species, probably we'll survive. I mean, there's 7.6 billion of us. You can't get rid of us that easy.
And that is a wrap. How's it going, man?
It's not going badly. I've never been on a show with so humble a moniker as Masters of the Universe before. I suppose that's the kind of thing you'd expect from somebody who would anonymously send me a Thrustmaster 300 and leave it on my porch for all the neighbors to see without actually letting anybody know what it was. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. And for folks who don't know, Peter Watts loves sci-fi games, so do I. And I sent him a HOTAS with a joystick so he can play EVE Online and Elite Dangerous. Did you download the game or no?
I haven't even actually loaded the software for the for the joystick yet, but it's something I want to do in December. I've decided to take December off just to get up on all this stuff.
Okay, we're gonna have fun then. All right, so then let's begin. And my first question to you is, Peter, how fucked are we?
I suppose that depends on who you mean by we. Life is going to persist. The cockroaches have been fine. The blue-green bacteria will be fine. As a species, I probably will survive. I mean, there's 7.6 billion of us. You can't get rid of us that easy. If you're the kind of person who likes playing Xbox or watching Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, pack them in now, because you've probably got another 20, 25 years tops before that infrastructure collapses.
20, 25 years?
Well, we're looking at within about 10 years, we're looking at the beginning of a series of rolling pandemics that are going to take out the inner cores of most of the metropolitan areas of the planet. Preliminary suggestions modeling gives us a sense of maybe 40-45% global infection rates, only probably less than 20% mortality rates. But you don't have to die to lose civilization. All you really need is for the guy who delivers your food and takes away your garbage to call in sick, and his backup to call in sick, and for that to happen for a couple of weeks.
Right.
It's basically going to be New Orleans after Katrina.
Ouch.
In every major city on the planet.
And is that primarily due to rising sea levels?
Well, what's basically happening with and it's a variable that hasn't really received a lot of attention, although it's starting to get more, is that as the world warms, pathogens change their distribution.
Yep.
There's 50 years ago, nobody had heard of Ebola. 20 years ago, nobody had heard of Zika. These things, there were, until recently, no recorded cases of Lyme disease in Costa Rica. But what there was in Costa Rica was essentially a big vacant penthouse suite of potential hosts that would serve as perfect vectors and perfect hosts for this thing as soon as some asymptomatic infected tourist happened to wander into the right zone.
Right.
So that's what's happening now. What's happening now is you've got all these old pathogens finding new hosts that don't have much in the way of defenses against them, and these things are really good at host switching.
Right.
So one of the consequences of climate change is simply going to be an increase in emerging infectious diseases. And we're seeing that now. It was a paper that in Nature that came out, must have been 15 years ago now, showing a timeline of epidemiological outbreaks.
Right.
And it just started, back in the 1700s. It was like womp, 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 womp. You get this almost exponential decline in the space between outbreaks. And that's not going to get any better.
Ouch.
They're suggesting that by 2090, the damage caused by climate change, by sheer physical damage caused by extreme weather events, will cost more than the entire global economy will be able to have in its coffers to fix. So at that point, there's just not either everybody volunteers and pitches in and fixes Miami
Right.
out of the goodness of their hearts, or you abandon those cities when they're flattened by the latest mega hurricane, or you just live in the ruins. That's another element. We're also expecting, a year ago I read that we were expecting all the arable land on the planet to be exhausted by 2070. Apparently that estimate has now been moved up to 2050 to 2060.
Right.
So I don't know if the word fucked even encompasses it. I think we might have to come up with a new word, furged or goobled or something, that the language does not encompass the level of catastrophe that we are in for.
So one thing I observed is that, we as human beings are quite capable of solving problems and catastrophes that are in front of us, and very incapable and almost incompetent when it comes to things that are, further away on the horizon. At the same time, the optimists will say, well, hey, we have technology, the technology, whatever you want to call it, that technology sort of hype. And hey, Malthus was proven wrong when he claimed that population will exceed and will run out of food. So why should climate change be any different?
Well, Malthus made a fundamental mistake in that he wasn't actually talking about population size. He was talking about population density.
That's true.
He was just noticing that in his particular part of the world, all the undesirables were moving in greater numbers. That was a redistribution. And that may have informed and misled some of his calculations. In terms of technology, of course we've got technology. That's kind of the problem. I don't consider myself a Luddite. Before you started rolling, we were talking about, best laptop I should get for VR. So it's not like I'm anti-technology by any means.
Right.
But the problem is that we have caveman brains.
Yeah.
With caveman agendas and caveman horizons of relevance, with our hands on technology that can change the world. If I give somebody a choice between $5 today and $20 in 2 weeks, most people would choose $5 today.
Yeah.
The technical term for that is hyperbolic discounting, and it makes a lot of sense in unpredictable environments where you never know whether the guy with the 20 is going to get schmucked by a bus or eaten by a tiger or something, right?
Right.
The flip side of that is that it gives you absolutely no ability to internalize long-distance consequences. And that's why even now, people in relatively progressive and non-climate change denying parts of the world are still unwilling to spend as much as the price of 2 lattes a month to fight climate change, because 2 lattes a month is something they got to pay now, and catastrophe's 20 years away. It's not even real as far as the gut is concerned.
Yeah, and not even real as far as a significant part of the American population, or I would say the world population, is concerned. And that's something slightly concerning for me. But then as someone who studies evolutionary biology, I'm not as surprised, right? And if you look at our ancestors, like, we're almost primed for pessimism, right? It's the humans who saw a rustle in the bush and decided to not check it out. It could be prey, it could be a predator. And the folks who decided that, hey, it's probably a predator and I'll run away, survived. The optimists who would actually try and dig in could either find the prize or they could be dead.
I would disagree with your
Yeah.
terms. I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I approve of what you're saying and where it's coming from.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a bias for pessimism. I think that's a bias for paranoia.
Explain that.
I think natural selection favors the paranoid.
Yeah.
But pessimism, I think that we as a species are wired for delusional optimism. They have done a number, there's a growing body of research suggesting that the people who are most objective amongst our numbers, the people who are best at assessing their own level of influence in local, in social environments with unknown variables, the people who are most accurate at attributing blame and credit in local situations, are the clinically depressed. The rest of us, for example, if something good happens to us, we will tend to take credit for that. If something bad happens to us, we tend to look for something else to blame. The clinically depressed don't.
Misattribution bias.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I find it very telling that the people amongst us who are empirically the most objective are those that we describe as victims of a pathology. In fact, we are so hardwired for optimism. You see people like Guillermo del Toro showing up in Time magazine a few months ago saying, optimism is the radical choice. There's a whole fucking subgenre now of science fiction called hope punk.
Really?
You've heard of cyberpunk,
Yeah.
dieselpunk, steampunk. Well, now there's hope punk because now wishful thinking apparently is edgy. Now delusional optimism is some kind of bullshit.
Oh, man.
Del Toro is wrong. Optimism is not the radical option. Optimism is the default option. As some guy on Reddit said, everybody fantasizes about being Mad Max. Nobody fantasizes about being one of the skulls piled up in the background. And
so then isn't that just a survival mechanism? Aren't all these traits just helping the human survive, and that's what we're
of
supposed
course,
to do?
I mean, natural selection promotes paranoia, but it also promotes hope, even when there's no empirical basis for that hope. Because if you actually, in an environment where predation and disease and high mortality, infant mortality is rampant, which is to say, throughout most of our evolutionary history, anybody who actually had an accurate view of their chances would probably curl up into a puddle of perspiration and just wait to die. So there is and again, if you're interested, I can show you the actual citations where people actually point out that we are delusionally optimistic and that this does have survival values, not because you are actually going to be Mad Max. You're not. You're going to be one of the skulls. But because it ups your chances of survival if you think you're going to be Mad Max. People who believe in free will tend to perform better on exams, for example.
Yep.
This belief in yourself, oddly enough, can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's still delusional. I mean, the idea of a cognitive bias is twofold. The first is that it evolved to help us survive.
Of course.
But the second part is that by definition, it's a bias. So we are enthralled. We are essentially a bundle of literally hundreds of cognitive biases that help us survive by lying to us about the way the world works. And that's kind of the problem we face now because we're capable of reshaping the world. We no longer are at the mercy of our environment. Our environment is at our mercy.
Right.
But we're still working on the basis of very ancient programs that are starting from a completely different premise. And I think that's the root of our problem at this point.
So how do we untangle ourselves from here? I mean, it has served us. I mean, again, one can argue, has it served us well or not? But maybe not the planet. But when it comes to the human species, arguably, prosperity has increased. and these traits have got us to where we are. Will we not be able to figure it out again? I mean, on one end of the spectrum, you have the escapists, right? Which is, hey, let's go colonize the moon. Let's colonize Mars. On the other end, you have the fundamentalist, which is, well, they'll just deny it, right? Like, yep, doesn't make sense. Even with all the data in the world, I'm going to stick to my subjective view. And then you sort of had in between the folks who are sort of optimistic but not really sure. So you have these like different diversity of units. And one thing, about species is the more diverse it is, the more odds are you can probably figure something out. So,
well, I'm sure that some of us are going to be just fine. I call them the 0 pointers because it's not just the 1%; it's the 0.1%. They're buying up ground in New Zealand.
Why New Zealand?
Because New Zealand is relatively isolated. It has a relatively mild climate. It will be relatively unaffected by climate change. And
really,
yeah. Also, missile silos in Colorado apparently are being recommissioned. This is based on an article I read recently. May have been in the Atlantic. I can dig out the specific reference later if you're interested. About a consultant who was hired by a bunch of 0 pointers to talk about the future, and they spent about the first 20 minutes asking him the standard questions about cryptocurrency and the sort of thing. And then one of them kind of broke the ice and said, "Okay, how do we deal with the event?" This guy's like, "What? What's the event?"
What event?
It turns out the event is a word that the ultra-rich use to shorthand the imminent planetary social collapse that they see as now inevitable, now that the world has been bled dry and that there's no longer any market share in it.
Really?
And one of the things that they were apparently most interested in getting this guy's input in is, how do we maintain control of our armed security forces once the ceiling crashes in and our money's no good anymore and they realize that they've got all the guns and we can't wipe our asses without somebody helping us? And I shit you not, in this article, one of the ideas they brought up was explosive collars for the paramilitary forces.
What?
So that you could blow somebody's head off if they got out of line. Like,
oh man,
seriously, this is something out of Dr. Strangelove.
I would think probably like automation, start getting more drones and automated.
This was
exactly that could work.
Oddly enough, the story that I have written on the train just coming in today for, believe it or not, I'm not allowed to say who they are because it's a corporate consulting thing. But I've written another story called Cyclopterus, which came out earlier this year, which is basically, that's one of the plot elements, that the ultra-rich basically decide that drones aren't going to turn on them. So they kick all these military people with, Middle Eastern passports or Middle Eastern stamps on their passports. They kick them to the curb. And a lot of those people are pretty pissed off enough to look for payback. And those people have deep military backgrounds and all sorts of resources. So, I mean, it's one of those revenge fantasies that warms your heart.
So there is some real context to that. So, for example, if you look at the foundation of ISIS, and, political science and geopolitics is one of my fun hobbies that I read up on. So fundamentally, one of the things that happened in Iraq was the U.S. came in, and one of the acts that they did, which folks regret now, is they decommissioned the entire army. So you had 1 million soldiers who had guns, but now they don't have jobs. Well, guess what they're going to do, right? So and a lot of them came from a certain sect of Islam, the Sunnis, and they ended up getting recruited to all these different terrorist and radical organizations because they didn't have a job, they were outcast in society, but they have guns and they have training, right? That's exactly what they're going to do. So
yeah, it's not just plausible. I think in some ways it's sociologically inevitable.
Okay. So how many 0 pointers do you know?
Not including you?
Oh, I'm not there yet. So.
I don't personally know any of them.
Okay.
I don't think that they would hang out with somebody like me. I mean, look at me. I'm wearing a hoodie covered with cat hair.
So I know a few 0 pointers, and they wear hoodies and at least the cool ones. So I'd be curious. We'll maybe I'll set up a dinner. I'm curious to see if their point of view on the event and so on. But again, there's diversity within the 0.1% as well. Not everybody agrees what the Koch brothers agrees with, right?
Yeah, and everybody says nice things about Bill Gates trying to cure malaria in Africa without mentioning the fact that he's also apparently gobbling up all the lithium rights in that continent as well. I don't really know about that stuff. I don't move in those circles, and it's very easy to fall into sort of rabbit holes of conspiracy theories.
Yeah,
that's something else about humanity. When we are in environments that are uncertain, that cause us to feel afraid, we are more likely to see, for example, patterns in random visual static.
Yes.
We're more likely to believe in gods.
Yes.
We're more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. Again, this is probably basically a downstream effect of an anti-predator reaction, where it makes sense to see agency in a dangerous environment, even if there is no agency, because the cost of looking like a chicken shit when you run from the wind is much less than the cost of being eaten by a tiger if you blow off a tiger as the wind. The whole, natural selection favors the paranoid thing.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. So I think it's going to be an awesome dinner. And you will be surprised. You will be pleasantly surprised. There are people who are screwed in the head far more than we are. So in a good way, in actually a good way. So
I've been told, I had dinner last night with a former investment banker who, because he had dirt on a number of people, got an incredible golden parachute and sort of retired at 30. This was back when there actually was a financial industry. And he has since sort of had his come to Jesus moment, and is now homeless. He basically sold his home, and he's going to basically wander the earth like Kwai Chang Caine.
Yeah.
But he spoke to me of all the millionaires that he knew on Bay Street, and he says they're all fucked. He says they're all shells of people that are desperately unhappy, and I don't know how much of that is wish fulfillment. How much of
I
it
would
is
say
actual?
so again, I mean, from my observation again, and this is my subjectivity here, speaking to many different people, 0.1%, 1%, 0.001% as well. Like human beings, we're all different. We're all unique. We all pursue our own agendas, and that's what makes this game interesting. There's no one, it's still just like the world state system is still anarchic. There's no one world government. The same, applies for the 0 pointers, as you call them. I'm actually going to borrow that word. This is pretty cool. I like the.
I'm trying to bring it into that. I've tried to do a couple of things in the past. I tried to bring in the term larva as a phrase for children. That never really caught on. I tried to introduce the term grab the bone as a phrase for get a clue from 2001, right? When the hominid picks up the bone. And so for conceptual breakthrough or get a clue, I was trying to get everybody to use the phrase grab the bone, but that never really caught on. I think maybe it sounded too pornographic. But yeah, maybe 0 pointers will catch on.
No, I like it. I'm going to start using it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now we're a conspiracy.
Yeah, honestly, we started off as let's talk about sci-fi, and we jumped right into conspiracy. Not that far off. So we're keeping, we're paying homage to good sci-fi.
Well, you make a good point in the sense that it's always, again, it's another universal human trait to try and monolithize the outgroup, the other guys, right, to make them all, and you're right, there's a lot of degrees of freedom there. But we are all humans. So there are all those degrees of freedom.
Right.
But we are all mammals. And so we do all have those biases. We do all have that, the hyperbolic discounting, the desire to, if not reproduce, at least fuck, which tricks us into reproducing. There are a number of, of course, one of the biggest cognitive biases is my children are the most important things ever, and nothing is more important than family, and my baby is the center of the universe. But in terms of ways of fixing this, there are people out there with a certain type of brain injury. If you lesion the ventromedial prefrontal cortex just so,
Yes, I've read that. Yeah.
You did?
It's really
Utilitarian
interesting. But
decisions.
please share that. Yeah.
Yeah, if you can basically immunize somebody against trolley paradoxes
Yeah.
by lesioning a certain part of their brain. And most of us would rescue our children from a burning building. And if forced to choose between rescuing our children or somebody else's, we generally choose our own because kin selection, nothing is more important than my genes. But these lesioned people would unhesitatingly, I'm about to belch now, so I'm just going to move off. These people would unhesitatingly abandon their own child to die if that meant that they could save 2 or more of a stranger's children.
Yeah.
And they're not sociopaths. They have a better sense of right and wrong than we do because it's based on rational ethics. It's not based on gut morality. These people are willing to do what works for the greater good, even at the cost of their own fitness. So you can see why something like that would never take off under Darwinian selection. And you can also imagine, the headlines the next day. Would it be selfless, noble person sacrifices her own children to save others? Or would it be monster mom leaves child to die in fire? I mean, we have these reflexes.
Right.
We have these gut impulses that when you look at them, I mean, they worked 50,000 years ago. Right now, they're nothing but destructive.
Yeah.
So getting back to fixes, I have increasingly grown to believe that the only real way to save humanity is by changing humanity into something else. I think we got to change these biases. If we could just get rid of hyperbolic discounting alone, that at least would allow us to put long-term consequences on the same footing as our current standard of living.
I would say
That
same
could
thing
do
with
a lot.
misattribution bias. There's a few constructs if he can remove, would change things. I don't know, good or bad, but they would change things.
It sounds pretty pie in the sky, right? We're going to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
down. What are we going to do? We're going to take a pair of needle-nose pliers and yank the neural wiring. But
What-
there are some hints as to how we can do this. Parkinson's disease, for example. Victims of Parkinson's disease are less religious than the rest of us. And that's weird because most victims of fatal diseases tend to be more religious because they're closer to death, the whole no atheists in foxhole syndrome. But apparently what happens is the pathogen that causes Parkinson's, which we think starts in the gut and actually works its way up to the brain through the vagus nerve, burns out whatever parts of the brain are involved in religiosity.
Yep.
There's a number of those. There's the temporal lobes. There's the right prefrontal cortex. There's a bunch of them. But my point is, we've got here a disease. It infects people. It impacts their neurochemistry. If we could tweak Parkinson's so that it becomes A, more infectious, B, leaves the rest of your brain alone, but C, continues to take out the religious centers, we could infectiously make our species congenitally less evil. I mean, we're talking here about systems of belief that have historically provided cover for, misogyny, racism, holy wars, mass extermination.
How would that approach be any different than, let's say, Nazi Germany looking for the pure race, whatever their definition is? How do we know this is the right approach versus, the other
Well,
one?
for one thing, I think that we could never get institutional approval for something like that. Nazi Germany was a bureaucracy. Nazi Germany made extermination a policy. I don't see that happening here. I see, if anything happens, I see somebody, buying a CRISPR gene editing kit for $150
Right,
through the mail
right.
and trying to tweak something in their basement. Basically, I see Heath Ledger, the Joker,
Right.
as a biotechnologist. And to anticipate your next question, yes, I fully expect there would be off-target effects. I fully expect things could go disastrously wrong. I fully expect that there could be somebody coming up with, I mean, just to take this one particular example, and I have others, somebody could come up with some kind of weird super Parkinson's that turns everybody into a short-circuiting bundle of nerves in 30 seconds. All of these things could happen. There are a great many horrific potential consequences of essentially using bioterrorism and like genetic terrorism as a way of rewriting human nature. However, we're wiping out 130,000 species a year as it is.
That's true.
And so the question is not, I mean, we are in a plane that was supposed to be cruising at 30,000 feet, is now at 10,000, and it is in a nosedive. The question is not, is a radical solution like engineering Parkinson's disease a good solution?
Right.
No. It's a dangerous solution.
Yeah.
It's a fucking insane solution.
Yeah.
The question is it less insane than continuing to wipe out 130,000 species a year? Do we really want to make the merely catastrophic the enemy of the downright apocalyptic?
Right.
That is the situation I think we're in now. We don't have much time. And let's face it, if we pull out of this current nosedive, we had a nuclear arms race. We nearly blew ourselves up with nukes before we found out about climate change. After climate change, if we manage to survive that, we're probably going to make, I don't know, a hard AI singularity or a gray goo nanotech apocalypse. The problem is never the technology. The problem is human nature. If we manage to cheat our way out of one apocalyptic scenario, we will make other ones because we always have. And only over the past couple hundred years have those scenarios threatened the entire planet. So ultimately, can you come up with an argument against eliminating the very biases that force us to continue to create these disaster scenarios?
So how do you think this is going to turn out?
Oh, I expect what's going to happen is that before the end of the century, large parts of the planet will be uninhabitable. I expect there will still be high-tech holdouts. There will be people who manage to sort of survive by walling, so the zero-pointers and their explosive collars. I suspect that the infrastructure amongst the rest of us will probably have collapsed. I suspect that we'll probably, I mean, we're already kind of living in a high-tech feudal state in terms of America describes itself as a democracy, but as Thomas Piketty said, unless you describe a democracy as a system in which when the majority of people want something that goes against the interests of the elites, they lose, America has not had a functioning democracy for decades.
That's true.
So we'll probably be in the same situation we are now, except with much lower tech and much less infrastructural support. I see a serious backslide.
Interesting. And I mean, by the way, folks, we weren't planning on a dark dystopian intro to this session, but the reality is that's where we're.
Excuse me, this is not a dark dystopian. This is delusionally optimistic. Remember, I'm just as human as the rest of you, right?
Agree.
And let's just take, for example, the IPCC report, which was supposed to be the one that gave us, from 2018, it was supposed to give us permission to freak out, because it basically said that disaster was now our best case scenario. And that if we kept things to 1.5 degrees, we'd only lose 90% of the corals. Only 350 million more people would die in extreme heat events. We'd still, all the tropical fish stocks would still be hammered, but we might be able to save a few weedy remnants up in the temperate zone.
Yeah.
And that's if we went completely carbon neutral by 2050, if we cut our meat and dairy consumption.
And I read the second summary of the report. We're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
even though we're nowhere near that, they really soft-pedaled it. Just a couple of weeks ago, a paper came out in Nature Communications. It turns out we've been underestimating the amount of flooding that's going to occur as a result of global warming by a factor of 3.
Wow.
The IPCC report did not factor in at all those rolling pandemics I mentioned earlier. They did not mention the fact that even if we cut our carbon emissions to 0 tomorrow, temperature in the Arctic zones is still going to go up from 3 to 5 degrees by the end of the temperature because we will have passed a methane tipping point. It did not factor in the impact of cryptocurrency mining because, and why should it? Who the hell cares about that? But at least preliminary research so far has suggested that the waste heat generated from the mining of Bitcoin alone is enough to add 2 degrees to the global thermal budget by 2030. So people are still moaning about the Paris Accords, which was only aiming for 2 degrees. The IPCC report was supposed to be a bucket of cold water in our faces, saying even at 1.5 degrees we're fucked. Now it turns out even the IPCC report was childishly optimistic. Every scenario we have envisioned, every computer projection, every model has always proven too optimistic. The optimists have always been wrong.
Yeah.
The pessimists have always been too optimistic. I am as guilty of that as anyone else.
Yeah.
There was there's as you know, a move afoot by various entrenched interests. Oh, we can't have cryptocurrency because criminals use cryptocurrency. It's untraceable. And my rejoinder to that was always, well, come on. You know what else is untraceable? Cash. What are you going to do? Outlaw cash? My investment banker friend tells me he's about to move to Australia. Apparently, there is now a move afoot by the government of Australia to outlaw cash. The slogan they're using is, cash is for criminals.
What? Is that true?
This is what I've been told. Okay. I have not had a chance to check it out because I had to sleep off the hangover and the depression and then jump on a train to come here.
Okay.
So I haven't had a chance to check it out. But he hasn't steered me wrong yet.
Well, I'm glad you could come here and we could have a nice discussion.
I'd like to point out that I also came here using a relatively low carbon means of travel.
Yeah, the train, which is way more efficient.
And it was downhill all the way, so they didn't even have the engine running.
Exactly.
It just sort of coasted.
Exactly. So I think the other side is that, I guess as an entrepreneur, my brain is always like, well, let's figure a way out to solve it. And even if you can't solve it, there should be some of us who are willing to die trying, right? Like it's fine. As long as you try and do the right thing. If you know you're going to die at the end of it, at least some of us should still try until the very end, right?
We all think we're going to be Mad Max.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we reconcile, if you're all screwed, then what's the point, right? But then our wiring will always tell us there's always hope, right?
And you know something? There is hope.
Okay.
The planet has undergone, and it's been said actually that we shouldn't be calling this the sixth major extinction. It's been said that we should call this the first extermination.
That's true, because the others.
It's It's the first time that this kind of level of extinction has happened as a result of deliberate let's call it malice, or at least depraved indifference
or conscious intent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this planet has previously undergone 5 major extinction events that have killed off anywhere from 70 to 96% of all the species. And in every single case, natural selection took this few weedy remaining survivors that were too tough to kill, and they built this incredibly diverse and wonderful and complex biosphere back out of those remains, those wretched remains. It'll take, if precedent's anything on, it'll go take anywhere from 15 to 30 million years for that to happen. But it will happen. The planet's got billions of years more before it gets swallowed up by the sun. And so
life finds a way.
Yeah. Life will come back. And as somebody with a biological background, the closest thing I can get to sort of an axiomatic starting point is that suffering is bad.
Right.
And if you can minimize suffering, that's great. And perhaps and most people would agree with that. I think where I differ from many people is that I include other species than our own in the suffering equation. And most people attribute zero value. If it's a question of human interest versus some other population, well, tough shit. God told us to fill the world up with our numbers and dominate it.
Well, or evolution. I mean, if you stand in front of a bear, chances are it is going to maul you and eat you if it's hungry. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, I'm not saying we're any worse than any other species.
But we could be
I'm just
better.
saying we're not essentially all that much. We're certainly smarter.
Yeah.
But so far, smarts doesn't. I mean, who's going to be left standing at the finish line?
Right.
You know, there was. I saw a couple of Olympics ago. There was this, the marathon run, and there was this person nobody had ever heard of, and she just pulled ahead right out of the gate, and she was way ahead of the pack. But she burnt, she blew her load, right? And eventually she just fell back into the pack, and then she fell behind the pack because she had that immediate advantage, but nobody took her seriously.
Right.
Because life was in it for the long haul. Life was the marathon.
Right.
I think that might be what we are. I think we're the people who are ahead of the pack now. We're the species that's looking around saying, behold our works, ye mighty in despair. And we haven't yet had our Wile E. Coyote moment. We haven't looked down and realized that we've actually already gone over the cliff.
Wow. Yeah. So I'm going to tie this into the world of sci-fi. Could this be I'm going to connect this with the Fermi Paradox, right? The one that everybody likes to talk about, cliched. Could this be one of the reasons, one of those great filters where, if intelligence and consciousness come together, there's a self-destruct button and then we have to restart again, and it just keeps going again and again?
I don't think you need even to bring consciousness into it, or even necessarily intelligence. I think it's a pretty reasonable presumption that Darwin's laws apply throughout the universe because they're really simple laws.
Can you talk a bit about that? How so?
They're almost tautological. I mean, basically, it's saying that as long as you've got a range of strategies, and some of those strategies work better than others, the worst strategies won't be able to outcompete. It's not going to be a problem until you have limited resources. But if you have limited resources, if you have variation in your population,
right,
and that variation is heritable, then what you're always going to get is not the fittest, but at least the least unfit, the most adequate, will survive at the expense of those that don't. So because that seems like, it's such a simple, obvious premise.
Right.
It's basically glorified cause and effect.
Yeah.
If that's true, then I think it's safe to say that the same processes that promote immediate fitness might be pretty ubiquitous throughout the universe.
Right.
Because natural selection has no foresight whatsoever. There's no way for the genes to look ahead and say, wow, this craving for sugar is doing us really well now. But 500 generations from now, it's going to lead to tooth rot and diabetes and all sorts of brain diseases, and we should probably dial back. There's no way for the genes to do that. All that natural selection can do is say, hey, this works now. I'm fitter than the next guy.
Right.
But
what about cooperation, right? I mean, another subset is species that tend to cooperate do better. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't that also apply for, let's say, civilizations and not just human? It could be alien civilizations.
Well, the question is cooperation against what? When you look at a lot of these things, you basically have a tribal response against an out group.
Right.
I mean, there was an actual headline in the Globe and Mail back in the 1980s, probably before any of you guys were born. The headline in the Globe and Mail was, Reagan assured Gorbachev of help against space aliens. And it had, this is not the National Enquirer.
I love it.
This is the Globe and Mail. And the picture showed Gorbachev holding a teddy bear and waving its paw at the audience. And his argument was actually pretty cogent, which was, we really wouldn't care about communism versus capitalism if we were invaded by Martians.
Exactly.
The thing that makes tribes cooperate is an external threat. So even that is, I mean, I have
could entropy be that threat?
That's something I've always played around with, even in a science fictional context. The idea that nothing reverses entropy. The concept of negentropy apparently is intellectually incoherent. But what we do as evolved organisms is we slow down entropy. We put the brakes on entropy. It's like taking a fire hose and forcing the water in that fire hose to go through 1 million capillary tubes, right?
Right.
It slows the total volume of the water still ends up at the end of the pipe, but it takes a lot longer to get there. So the more complexity you have in the universe, the further you got to wait till heat death.
Yep.
The more complexity you can build, the longer the universe will live. I think that's a pretty epic. It's an idea I've played around with in a couple of video games.
Do you think it's like a Half-Life situation where it'll never go to zero? It'll just kind of, and we figure out a way because
a Zeno's paradox of heat death. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, similar to that. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, time basically stops when energy runs out.
Yeah.
At some point, I mean, if the energy hasn't run out, then time will continue. At some point, the last electron flips from one way to another and everything just shuts down. Unless we have, bump into another multiverse or a P-brain or whatever whatever the string theorists are talking about these days.
Well, the multiverse seems to be gaining more strength these days. String theory, not so much, but yeah.
Yeah, one kind of emerged from the other, though, wasn't it? It used to be string theory, now it's brain theory. In either case, and I haven't read much stuff since I read the latest one of Brian Greene's books on it, but in either case, there are still those who argue that it's not so much science as philosophy, because how the hell can you test it?
Right.
I understand that there is some possible suggestions that we could see echoes or holes in the cosmic microwave background that might suggest collisions with a previous universe. And I'm certainly no expert. I think it would be very cool if we could do that.
Yeah.
But I'm surprised that the brain theorists are having a resurgence. I did not realize that.
And I know we spoke a bit about that last time we had dinner. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Explain, to folks listening in, what the.
I'm not sure I can, because the last time we had dinner, we rolled a series of D20s to decide what shooters we were going to have. So if you want me to reach back and continue that conversation, you're going to have to give me way more in the way of key points.
All right. Actually, you know what? There's another interesting topic, because I know we're talking about climate change, sci-fi, but your personal story is also really fascinating, right? I personally found it really fascinating and hilarious at the same time, and a couple of incidents I just want to pick and would love to hear your version of it. One of them is, your not so, it's quite recent, trouble with the U.S. Border Patrol, who decided for no reason to stop you, and that led to this whole incident, which ended up you sending modified DNA to the U.S. government, which contained DNA from a platypus. So, and folks, this is not a sci-fi story. These are true events. So, Peter Watts, take it away.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
okay, you're actually covering about 2 years worth of events here.
It's a short story.
It is a I
See.
suppose. I was helping somebody move to Nebraska in December of what was it, 2008, late 2008, maybe late 2009. Yes, 2009, I believe it was.
And that was it. You would just
That was
helping
all I
someone
was
move.
doing. I mean,
Yeah.
they said it was a random search, but then they said it was a random search because I was driving a rented black SUV, which is what drug dealers frequently drive. So it makes me kind of wonder what Officer Beaudre, where he learned his definition of the term random. But
So you were driving to the border.
we're getting
and you
ahead of
got
ourselves,
stopped.
right?
Yeah.
Down to Nebraska.
Yeah.
We had been told to avoid the Port Huron border crossing because those guys were assholes. So we went through Detroit. They were assholes too, but they let us through. We dumped the stuff off. There was the first major snowstorm of the year. It was coming up on our tails, so we wanted to get home
Right.
as fast as we could. And at this point, the shortest route was through the Port Huron border crossing. No problem, we thought. The assholes were on the U.S. side. And you never get stopped by the guys in the country you're leaving. You
true.
get stopped by the guys in the country that you are entering.
Yeah. People should be happy to let you go, right?
Yeah. So 2 kilometers from the U.S. border, or from the Canadian border, Canadian-U.S. border, somebody waves at me. And I wave back and keep going because what the hell? And the guy I'm riding with is, I think they wanted you to pull over. I said, okay. So I pulled over.
I think you're used to Canadian cops.
I've
could
had
have
some
been part of
experience
the
with
problem.
Canadian cops too. We can get into that as well. I'm actually on record in the U.S. as being a cop tickler in Canada,
Oh, wow.
actually from Guelph.
Okay. So you pulled over
So I
eventually?
pulled
or?
over. Oh, not even eventually. It was just like, we were talking a 5-second delay.
All right.
And this woman comes storming up to me and says, when I wave at you, I'm not just saying hello. I want you to pull over. And I said, well, I suppose there could be a cultural difference because, where I come from, waving actually does mean hello. And she did not appear to, that did not appear to ease her mood at all, which is kind of sad. I thought I was being kind of charming. She asked the regular questions. She demanded where I was going, where I was coming from, wanted to see the pink slip from the car, all this stuff. And all of a sudden, I noticed that there are these other border guards who've popped the back trunk and are going through our stuff.
Without asking.
Without asking, without telling. They're just doing it. And I happen to know that this actually violates their own protocols. So I turned to mention this to the person beside, to the officer, but she has gone to the back of the truck and is talking to somebody else. So I get out of my vehicle. And that's basically the point at which everything went to shit. Depending on who you read on the internet, depending on the various reports and so on that were filed, I was high on angel dust, and I picked up a female guard and threw her across the hood of the car. One person testified, Officer Beaudry testified, that he had come across several lanes of traffic to get involved because it was obvious that I was resisting arrest, not realizing that an hour before, the person he was actually coming to help had testified that she'd never gotten around to trying to arrest me.
Wow. So what happened?
Basically, what it comes down to is that not getting on the ground fast enough after being punched in the face by a border guard is a felony under Michigan statutes. And it's the same statute that encompasses everything from, quote, failing to follow a lawful command, all the way up to attacking somebody with a chainsaw.
Wow.
The statute spends 3 paragraphs defining what a person is. it does not spend a word defining what the phrase lawful command means. So if Officer Beaudry says, strip naked, get down on your hands and knees, and bark like a dog, is that a lawful command? Because Officer Beaudry has had 12 weeks of training in a Virginia summer camp? I wasn't sure, which is probably how I ended up getting maced. And at this point, I was told that, I think that's where the angel dust story got started, because...
So that was false.
What? Oh, no, of course. I was driving.
Yeah.
I would have certainly have let myself level off before I got behind the wheel. But I guess the impression was that after, like they were telling me to get back in the vehicle. Eventually, I got back in the vehicle, but by this time, somebody was in the vehicle with me and was kind of grabbing my lapels and punching me. My reaction was, what is the fucking problem? Although I didn't even say fucking. I just said, what is the problem? Because I was being really polite to this guy who was between me and the steering wheel, punching me in the face. Then they wanted me to get out of the vehicle again. And then they maced me. And then I started, at this point I was handcuffed, and the thing is I could see that they were about to spray me. So I closed my eyes. Seems like a reasonable precaution.
Right.
The fact that I didn't immediately curl into a ball and start screaming like a baby apparently was considered evidence that I was high on something, because obviously I just blew off the pepper spray.
Wow.
But in fact, what I did was I kind of wiped my eyes and at that point I was hyper-producing mucus because, we have this weird capsaicin stuff going through your... But nobody would blow my nose for me. I kept asking if somebody would blow my nose, and they refused to. So I started just blowing my own nose by just exhaling hard through my nose to try and avoid suffocating, at which point I was told that if any of my snot hit any of the officers, I would be charged with assault.
Wow.
I ended up... Again, this was all of a sudden, now we were in the teeth of this major winter storm that we were trying to avoid. There's the jail they stuck me in had this sort of this heated central place where they would let you go into every now and then to get these little TV trays with 4 different types of the same kind of beans and purple Kool-Aid. But then you'd have to go back into these side areas, which were just cinder blocks, and as far as I could tell, completely unheated. And it was weird because I spent the night burning up because the entire part of my body was still saturated with this pepper spray.
Ouch.
So I was feeling like I was constantly burning, but of course that's not there's no thermogenesis there, right? So I'm actually shivering. I'm actually going hypothermic while at the same time feel like I'm burning up. It was a really interesting...
Wow.
It was a really interesting experience.
So I believe that's when the community and folks lined up, because obviously they had no idea you're now an author, you have a following, and obviously eventually that led to you being deported to
I
Canada?
don't have that much of a following, but a lot of the people that I know do.
Yeah.
You may have heard of a guy called Cory Doctorow. You may have heard of a guy called Neil Gaiman. Mm-hmm. These people just started tweeting it. And I was like, I didn't know that this was going on, right? I'm stuck in this jail.
Right.
As far as I know, nobody even knows that I'm here.
Yeah.
But, Cory puts it on Boing Boing, and half the internet wakes up. Nice. Before I know it, I've got over $60,000 for my legal defense fund.
Nice.
I didn't do any of this, right? I was still in jail. I had kind of a bail hearing. I had to pay $500. They were going to let me out. But then all of a sudden they weren't. All of a sudden I was going back to general population. And I didn't know why that was. I ended up in general population. I was the only white guy in the entire pod. It was strange. Wow. They didn't allow us pillows because apparently you stuff pillows down the toilet. So what you had to use are these old paperback books, one of which was Mr. God, This is Anna, which was some kind of book of Christian apologetics, and another was an advanced review copy of a Tor is my own publisher, a Tor paperback called The Loch, a science fiction book about the Loch Ness Monster. That's what I slept on that night. At any rate, finally they were going to let me out, but the guy who was running the pod says, you know, you can leave if you want to, but they're just going to arrest you as soon as you leave and charge you with something else.
That's crazy. Wow.
And I thought, well, I might as well go through with this. And in fact, they were about to do that. I could see them waiting on the other side of the door as I was heading out. But
wait, why would they do that?
Because why not? They have a captive audience, right?
Wow.
They could have just charged me with something else. I don't know what they had charged me with at that point. Like I say, this statute includes everything.
Wow.
But at that point, they were starting to get calls from the media. And so at that point, they let me go. But they didn't give me my coat. They didn't let me go back to the car. They said that the lot was closed, which is not true. The lot was open 24 hours a day. They basically drove me across the bridge and dumped me in shirt sleeves on the other side in the middle of this winter snowstorm. And
it's funny, you know, what the state can get away with. I mean,
oh yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the rationale too. You know, these people put their lives on the line. They're fighting terrorism. It's bullshit. Cops don't even make the top 10 in terms of dangers. Like real cops who actually have to pursue bad guys don't even make the top 10 in terms of homicide rates. The profession that gets killed most often are taxi cab drivers. But nobody seems to give them. Certainly, like border guards. They basically get paid to sit there hassling truck drivers, right? They don't have they don't. And as a matter of fact, the one of the people who arrested me was himself arrested for possession of 2 days later. What? Which was something I got to put into my letter of, quote, remorse, unquote. Okay.
Wow.
Anyhow, the trial was kind of a fiasco. We utterly demolished everything that the prosecution said.
Then I believe you got...
But I got convicted.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Because at the very end, when the prosecution had the final word, and she was actually quite brilliant about it, it was, she said, look, if you don't think he did any of these things, that's fine. If you want this put down in a bubble, when we told him to get on, when Officer Boji told him to get on the ground, before he got on the ground, he said, what's the problem? And that's failure to comply. Right there, you have to convict him on that basis. They didn't have video footage because this was not an actual border stop, right? This was on the other side of.
This was 2 kilometers away.
Yeah, this was between the two border things. What they had was an automatic camera that took a snapshot every 2 seconds.
Wow.
And they tried to play that back. They did play that back. They slowed it down so that it looked like I stood there refusing to obey for 30 seconds. When we called them on that, because the timestamp, they were stupid enough to have a timestamp.
Oh God!
On the bottom of the thing, and it was taking 5 seconds for the timestamp to increment 1 second.
That's crazy.
And when
so the judge probably wasn't happy.
When we pointed that out, they said, "Oh, sorry, there's a computer glitch."
Oh, of course.
Anyhow, I was convicted. I was found guilty. Several jury members actually went online saying, we think this is bullshit. We have to convict because that's the way the law is written.
Right.
But the border guard's behavior was indefensible. One of the jurors actually wrote a letter on my behalf to the judge.
Wow.
And stood with me at my sentencing.
Wow.
Which resulted in her spending an entire year being harassed by the local police force for reasons which I'm sure have absolutely nothing to do with it. Yeah, no, she was...
You're kidding me.
At one point, she was arrested because she was suspected of robbing one of those paycheck cashing short-term loan places, even though camera footage of the incident showed a middle-aged man in a beard. But because her husband was a Native American who was a trapper, the argument was she could have fashioned a fake beard out of animal skins. This was the kind of shit she was putting up with. She would come home from she got fired from her job as a security guard for no cause given. She came home and found that her place had been basically trashed. Her family was nowhere to be found. They had all been frog marched. They'd all been frog marched down to the local precinct on some other trumped up charge. None of them were ever charged with anything. I ended up, fortunately, I had a few $1,000s left in my legal defense fund. I ended up paying her mortgage for a month because it was a choice between having a roof over their heads or paying their lawyer. So I actually feel like I made a pretty good lifelong friend at that point. She had to put up with a lot of shit. Anyhow, the judge kept me hanging for the longest damn time. We had this long, rambling discourse about how ever since 9/11 we must respect our authority figures and blah, blah, blah. And he didn't, I was a weird person and he didn't know if I was just a free spirit or what, but that finally he decided that I was the kind of person he'd like to have a beer with. And that justice, as far as he was concerned, was what he said it was in his courtroom. So he basically let me off.
Wow.
I had to pay like a $1,500 fine to cover various miscellaneous court.
And I remember you had to write some kind of a letter.
No, that's a
after,
sequel,
right?
and we may not even have time to cover that.
Fair enough.
That was 6 years later.
All right, cool.
But in this case, it was. I actually got a couple of new readers out of it. I was in the elevator going down to the basement to pay my fine, and there was this big, tough-looking, bald dude there, sort of sitting there with tattoos on his arms. And he kind of looked down at me, and he sized me up, and he says, "I don't know if you staged this whole thing just to get more people to read your stuff, but I went on Land the other night, and I read something by yours. I think it was called The Things. And he said, it was really good."
Yeah. Nice.
And he had actually not seen John Carpenter's original movie, so he didn't actually know.
Oh, he did not. Okay,
he did not know the original movie that story was riffing off of, but he thought it was pretty cool.
Cool.
So anyhow, I went home, but at this point, at that point, I was, because I'm now a felon in Michigan, I was banned from returning to the U.S.
Okay.
I did, however, have to tender a DNA sample so that they can.
Yeah.
They also had to take my fingerprints because the first time they fingerprinted me in Michigan, they used a machine that was a proprietary machine that had been sold to them by somebody whose brother worked in the business, right? And that person had died of a fatal aneurysm. And so nobody knew how to calibrate the machines. They kept taking my fingerprints, and the thing kept losing focus, and nobody knew how to fix it. So anyhow, in Canada, I had to get, where they know how to fingerprint people right. They basically said I can get fingerprinted in Canada and I can produce this DNA swab in Canada. Well, back in 2007, I did a postdoc in molecular genetics. I really sucked at it. I'm terrible at molecular genetics. I didn't get a single decent sequence in the entire 2 years. But what I did do is I made some friends at the molecular genetics lab at the Royal Ontario Museum.
Nice.
So before I went in to produce my DNA sample, I got one of these friends to mix up a slurry of DNA from a half a dozen different species, like whatever she happened to have lying around in the freezer, right? I think there was some ibex in there, and there was some cactus, and there was, I don't know, there was just a weird bunch of shit.
That is so awesome.
And before I showed up, I just sluiced my mouth out with this. I have no idea if they ever processed or sequenced the DNA sample. I have no idea if it turned out. I mean, I have way more cheek cells and way more saliva than there was in this tiny little vial.
Wow.
But on the other hand, polymerase chain reaction, the whole point of that is that it takes small samples, small snippets of DNA and magnifies them. It's basically a genetic photocopier. So I really have no idea whether that played out or not, or how it played out.
That's amazing.
But I like to think that somewhere somebody thinks that there's this weird hybrid of 8 different species wandering around free in Canada who should be in the Smithsonian or something.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so I want to switch back to sci-fi and books, right? Your love of writing. how can you talk a bit about how you got into sci-fi for all the topics and all the genres? Sci-fi doesn't seem like someone who's writing research papers, although it could be, but physics seems a more appropriate sort of a segue. But you were a marine biologist.
Yeah, I wanted to be a marine biologist since I was 5 years old. When a kindergarten friend of mine asked me in to see his aquarium. I was in Calgary at the time. I grew up in Calgary. And all I knew about aquariums was that the local brewery had an aquarium that was like, it was like this whole floor, and there was like an octopus, and it was this sort of blue-green lighting. It was like a subterranean grotto, and there were these giant tanks, and there were sharks, and there was this octopus. That was my idea of an aquarium. And also on the second floor, there was this museum. This was the prairies, remember? There's a museum showing a bunch of natives dancing around a pole with spikes through their nipples, which was not, as I understood it, part of the actual aquarium. But this was my concept of an aquarium, right? And this guy said he had an aquarium in his basement. And I was like, wow, this is going to be amazing. And I went downstairs, and it was like this 10-gallon tank with some guppies and swordtails in it. And somehow an ass-backwards thing happened. Instead of thinking, this isn't an aquarium, this is bullshit, I thought, wow, anyone can have an aquarium.
Nice.
So at the age of 5, I decided I wanted to study fish for a living. I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Okay, wow.
At the age of 7, I plagiarized part of a Walt Disney adaptation of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I wrote like 3 pages of what I could remember from what I'd heard on Sunday radio in purple crayon on foolscap, and gave it to my dad. And my dad was nice enough to not point out that he knew that I was a plagiarist. And at that point, I decided, hey, this is easy. I'm going to be a science fiction writer. So I decided I wanted to be both of those things within a couple of years of each other when I was still very young.
Wow.
And I flopped back and forth. I ended up going into marine biology because, there's plenty of evidence that you don't need any kind of formal training to make it as a writer. But there's no way you can be a self-taught marine biologist.
Yeah.
But that was really only a day job until I, broke through and became a best-selling author. And I went through the entire, and I basically ran out of degrees to get before I actually sold anything.
Right.
But then I was working for and I managed to sell a few short stories and so on, but I was still a marine mammologist. And in the early 90s, I was working with a consortium of universities that was trying to explore why marine mammal populations had collapsed by 80 to 90% in the space of 10 years in the North Pacific.
Wow.
And there were some interesting clues. For one thing, marine mammals that fed on fish were being really hammered. Marine mammals that fed on krill and plankton were doing okay. Another interesting clue was that the U.S. commercial fishing industry had moved into that area about 3 years before the decline started and started hoovering up all the fish. So this seemed like a really obvious working hypothesis. We should check out the overfishing hypothesis.
What year was this?
Sorry?
What year was this?
This was in the early 90s.
Okay.
1990. I did my first postdoc in 1991, so I guess I came back in 92. It was somewhere between 92 and 94 at this point.
Right.
Turns out that 90% of the funding for this consortium of universities came from, you guessed it, the U.S. commercial fishing industry and the various banks in Alaska that supported them. And they didn't directly put any pressure on me, but my boss, who was a guy I went through grad school with, dude by the name of Andrew Treitz, who I managed to kill off in a very ugly way in one of my novels, was out, well, of course, you don't want to ignore the overfishing hypothesis, but, look at this interesting here. Maybe it's sexually transmitted disease. Maybe it's a caliquidias. Sea lions, they're really known for their loose morals. Oh, maybe it's killer whale predation. Maybe the killer whales ate all the sea otters. Oh, it's like, and it was...
Sea lion STD, really?
That was literally he would, the guy literally buttonholed me in a stairwell at one point and started writing numbers on the back of a napkin.
So you really saw, corporate interests coming into play and how they're applying pressure.
This is the cool thing.
This is really
I have
interesting.
no evidence that there were corporate interests involved at all. I know. I saw the budget, so I know that the U.S. fishing industry was paying for the research. But nobody from the U.S. fishing industry told me what to do. It was just this opportunistic doofus that I'd gone through grad school with, and you know, he did sort of have a way of saying, "Oh, you've got this database. Mind if I use it?" He did seem to be kind of needy that way, but he was more of a politician than anything else. But he knew which side his bread was buttered on. He was a mover. He was a shaker. He set up this. You know, he pitched this consortium idea to the fishing industry by describing the sea lion situation as the
Sounds like a
spotted owl.
lobbyist.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lobbyist. Yeah.
I put up with it for a year and a half and I quit.
Okay.
And at that point I was unemployed and I figured, what the hell? I've got 8 months of UI checks. I might as well try and write a novel.
Right.
Rest is history.
And yes, I mean, the rest is history, and you're still writing, which is fascinating and awesome for the rest of us. Out of all your books, and I've read a bunch of them, I've read your short stories as well, which is why I started, stalking you and then sending you random Thrustmasters in front of your porch.
I mean, seriously, even the packaging of that thing made it look like a giant dildo. Like,
Oh, God.
you can't even fit it inside a knapsack, right? You have to carry it around with
Peter,
the word
it's-
Thrustmaster.
Peter, you wanted to know what it feels like in a VR to fly. So you got to have a joystick and you got to have the actual thing. So
It looks amazing. It really does.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to playing Elite Dangerous.
yeah, we
Yeah,
should check it
no,
out. It'll be
it's-
fun.
it's-
It'll be fun.
Before the end of the year, I'm going to be immersed in that shit.
No, we're gonna have fun. I'll because you can have like co-op play.
Is there a multiplayer aspect?
Yeah, there is.
Really?
And so it's basically mapped 1-to-1 to the Milky Way galaxy.
Uh-huh.
So we can actually go to actual star systems and so on, and now you can do planetary landings and stuff.
Apparently, it's got a hugely steep learning curve.
Yes and no. Yes and no. It's fun. You're gonna have fun.
Okay.
Right?
Is it? I mean, presumably, I just sit down when I do all this stuff, right? There's no actual walking around. Like
No, there is. So
There is.
So that's EVE Online. This is Elite Dangerous. This is actually we're gonna fly around. It's awesome. So we'll get into that when we play. But
let's geek out on that in
yeah.
a way that will be less boring to the audience at some point.
Yeah, no, for sure. So out of all your books and works, what's your favorite?
I don't know. Somebody asked me that.
yeah.
Somebody called Velda asked me that on Facebook a while ago, and I can't answer. I mean, Starfish is the only book I've written that was as good as I knew how to make it when I sent it off, and that's because it wasn't under contract. It was my first novel. Like nobody laid a deadline on me.
Right.
So I guess I'd have to say that was the one I was happiest with. It's not necessarily my best book. It was my first novel.
Right.
Probably it's a lot rougher than the others. I haven't gone back and read it. But although it may not be my best novel, it's the only novel I wrote that was as good as I knew how to make it before I sent it off.
Okay.
Blindside is obviously the one that put me on the map.
That's my favorite, by the way.
It's the one that has got, even a couple of 0 pointers interested in me, apparently.
Yep.
Apparently I have it's getting taught as a required core text in neuropsychology and philosophy courses and so on and so forth. And weirdly, Tor is re-releasing some brand new sort of classics reissued version of it next year. So they threw the galley edits at me just a few months ago. So I read it again for the first time since the damn thing came out in 2006.
Really? Wow.
I've just
Cool.
finished rereading it. And you know something? It's not that good. Like, what? I mean, I gotta say, I mean, there was always a contingent of people who said, this is turgid bullshit. The man obviously knows nothing about science. His prose is crap. He's a misogynist.
Okay.
He's a racist.
Okay, to be honest, like what I almost closed the book in the beginning because I saw the word vampire and I'm like, okay, this sounds like another Twilight. I'm like, I don't want that. But
It was
you know,
not another Twilight.
the whole premise of what a super predator would look like that hunts humans and what kind of cognition is involved was extremely fascinating.
I liked it. I was kind of proud of it at the time. I think the difference is over the past decade or so, I've started to believe my own PR. It's like there's these people on, there are people on Reddit who consider me a god, and I keep reading these reviews about, yes, this book really fucked me up, man. I totally changed the way I think about the universe. It made me think about, changed the way I think about intelligence and consciousness, and totally changed my life. And I went back and reread it, and well, no, it didn't change the way I felt about anything because I'd written the damn thing in the first place, right?
That's true.
So
That's
it was
true.
no great revelation to me. It was a fine book.
Yeah.
It was well enough written. I might change a few phrases now and then if I had a chance to write it again. But and I made one or two egregious scientific boners, like the mutation that was responsible for a lot of the downstream vampire physiologies that ended up sticking on the Y chromosome.
Yeah.
So how come there are any female vampires? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But and it was a fine book, but I guess I just spent so much time ego surfing and reading about what a life-changing experience this was that when I read it and my life wasn't changed, I thought, that kind of sucked.
Now, I think what was interesting, from as a reader's point of view is, I try and read, not just sci-fi books or just, news or just general business books and science books, but also scientific journals, right? So a lot of the concepts weren't new or alien to me, but it's just a narrative, right? Like as a human being, we love stories and we love a narrative.
Yeah.
So you sort of weave many different concepts together and just build this really beautiful kind of a soup, right? It's just an amalgamation of interesting concepts and weaved it into a story that at least helped me visualize, oh shit, this is what a potential society output in the near future could look like. And how should we deal with that, right? That was the other piece. You actually dealt into... So I used to read a lot of Dostoevsky. So, he goes into the psychology, right? So it wasn't just, like the space operas, right? And I'm kind of bored of them, which is this is either utopian or dystopian. Take your pick. Like Hamilton or Reynolds. Take your pick.
Yeah.
But in your case, you actually go through the emotions, the psychology, and you leave things unanswered. Right?
Well, I mean, honestly, I didn't know if it was any good when I finished it.
Okay.
Tor obviously wrote it off as dead on arrival.
Did they?
Yeah, no,
That's actually a good sign. That's
I think one of the major book
Yeah.
distributors that existed back then basically didn't pre-order any copies.
Right.
So Tor had decided to go for a print run of 5 copies or something.
Wow.
And they really cheaped out on the cover art because there'd been some problems with them before. They decided that I got them to promise that they would give me input on cover art. So they gave me a choice of 3 potential covers, and I picked one. And then they went with a completely different one that I had not seen. And it's basically a flying corkscrew flying over in orbit over a ball of pubic hair in space. And the color, I mean, I just thought it was atrocious. For what it's worth, I think the new Classics Illustrated reissue has even worse cover art.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, no, it was. They obviously they had to publish it because they were contractually obligated to, but they obviously didn't have any expectations for it at all.
Right.
I didn't have any expectations for it at all. That's why I ended up giving it away.
Okay.
Because it started to get buzz.
Right.
And nobody could buy it because
Right.
the print run had been so damn small.
Wow.
There were some genre specialty stores on the West Coast where it was like their number 1 bestseller for 3 weeks running based on 0 actual physical sales because they didn't have any in stock. It was entirely back ordered, and it was still their number 1 bestseller. I mean, not a New York Times bestseller, just the local Sci-Fi store bestseller. And Tor kept for some reason, to this day, it mystifies me, just really resisted going for a second printing.
Why?
I don't know. The first time it was like, well, yeah, it's selling really well, and well, at first it was tanking, but then the buzz started, and it started selling really well, and it was like, yeah, we'll wait till we sell out the current printing before we print another one, and then they sold out the current printing, and then yeah, we sold out the current printing, but we haven't shipped all that stock out yet. So we'll wait till the warehouses are empty before and then the warehouses were empty. Yeah, I think we'll wait till a little more demand has built up.
Right.
And it was like, you fuckers. This thing on the basis of demand became, a local genre bestseller based totally on back orders. What do you need for demand? And that was the point at which I decided, okay, I'm fucked. There are now
wait,
two.
I mean, they're capitalists. I mean, why would you not want to get profit? Well, I don't get it.
Okay, they're capitalists, but they're also herring.
Okay.
There are selectors. I think what they do is they lay 1 million eggs.
Yeah.
And they basically leave it to random chance to see which two or three of those make it to adulthood. So you're an editor, and you have to put up with an asshole like me,
right,
who's constantly saying, dude, you didn't pay this person for their author photo. You didn't even credit them for the author photo. At least give them a couple of $100 out of petty cash. You're stuck with this person who,
so you pissed him off, basically.
Who to do me credit, did try to, at one point I caught them putting a negative review, a negative blurb for a different book on one of my novels. It was presumably in layout. I had some issues with these guys. When Starfish sold well, they owed me royalties in the first period. It basically came down to a legalistic definition of whether 6 months means less than 6 months or equal to 6 months, right?
What?
And they had to admit to me that, yes, according to the contract, they weren't arguing that the contract said they owed me royalties, but that just wasn't their policy, and I could talk to their lawyers if I wanted. Right? So I would try and deal with these things. Hell, a bunch of copies of Starfish got published in the first edition. I don't even have a first edition of my own copy of it. They never sent me first editions of my own first novel. A number of books got published with 40 pages missing from the middle of them.
Wow.
I would try and deal with these things politely and reasonably and behind the scenes and professionally, right? And I would just basically be told to get stuffed. So then I would complain about it on my blog, and of course that makes me a difficult author.
Okay.
So when
you got siloed.
When you're an editor who has, who on the one hand has to deal with, me, but on the other hand, I'm a herring egg.
Right.
Losing money on 98% of the books is kind of built into their business model. So even in terms of capitalism, it wasn't a big sacrifice for this guy to make in order to avoid me hassling him. So I think that's what happened. And at that point, it was like, okay, either the book's going to tank, my career as writer's over, and nobody can read the book, or the book's going to tank commercially, my career as a writer's over, but anyone can read the book because I put it up online.
Right.
And that's what I did. And they're still trying to get me to take it down. In fact, at one point they offered me, increased royalties on my backlist if I would take it down, and I told them no. But they put up with it, and the next week, I was breaking my contract.
Yeah. Okay.
But the next week, hardcover sales tripled, and the rest was it's never been out of print since.
Yeah.
It's like it's available in like 20 languages.
Yeah.
There's some absolutely awesome fan creative stuff about it. I'm wearing a hoodie now that's
it seems
that's concert merch from a concept album that's been based around it. It's done well. But to circle back, I'm sorry for going on for so long, but I can actually finally answer your question, which I couldn't before.
Go for it.
The book that I'm proudest of.
Yes.
It's possibly the worst book, or maybe the second worst book I've ever written. It's a video game tie-in called Crisis Legion. I wrote it in 3.5 months under terrible, terrible circumstances.
All right.
I had to take somebody else's plot. It was a blow-by-blow adaptation of a not especially smart video game. But video games, by and large, can't afford to be that smart, because if you talk about us running into aliens who can travel interstellarly, it's a Bambi versus Godzilla scenario.
Yeah.
Realistically, Bambi's never going to take out Godzilla, but Bambi has to have a chance against Godzilla for the game to be playable.
Yeah.
So what I basically had here was a chance to take something that essentially epitomized all the essential dumbness of any playable first-person shooter and try and retcon it so that it made sense.
That's cool. Yeah.
And I ran into some resistance from the CEO, and there were some real problems. There were times I thought that it wasn't going to come off, and it may not even be a very good book. But man, if you can get your dog to read, you don't complain because he moves his lips when he does it, right? This is not great art, but having to write a novel from scratch in 3 months,
wow,
and take something that's fun. I mean, it helps because Richard Morgan wrote the original script, so I had some good stuff to work with.
Okay,
but it was still a video game.
Right.
And to take some of the essential dumbness that's inherent in all these kinds of video games and retcon it into something that actually makes a certain amount of pulpy neurological, biological sense.
Right. That's cool. Yeah, no, I
it's
I
an
can
accomplishment.
It's
It's
not
tacky
easy.
accomplishment,
Yeah.
it's stretched creative muscles I have never had to stretch before or since, and I would do it in a second again, even though there was a lot of angst and fraughtness to go with it.
And that's like usually the thing about life, right? It's the things that make us struggle and push our limits and boundaries are often the most internally rewarding and satisfying, right? It may not make the most money, but
and it may be ugly as sin when it finally makes it to market.
Right? But at least you enjoy it. No,
But
thanks
at
for
least it's
sharing.
breathing. Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna check out that book, and to close it off, our focus of our podcast is around young folks, right? Millennials, Gen Z, and many of them are intrigued by the path of like writing. What would your advice be to them if folks wanted to start out on their journey as sci-fi authors or just writing in general? What would you say?
I honestly don't think I'm in a position to give that advice. I can't, should never do what I did, right? Become a scientist, okay? Quit in a huff. Alienate your publishers. Get arrested at the border and be threatened with jail. Because
modify your DNA.
Because that's probably responsible for my Hugo, right? All of a sudden, the huge spike, right? Then nearly die of flesh-eating disease.
Wow.
Because that produced another spike. Like every time something horrible happened to me, there'd be a spike in hits, and then I'd win an award. So I'm not, it's everything I did was wrong.
Right.
And I think the only take-home message you can take from that is that there are a million different writers out there. There have to have been a million different trajectories to get there.
Yeah.
If somebody tells you that you have to write every day or you're not a real writer, it's bullshit. If somebody tells you that you should just be grateful you're getting published, and never alienate your editor or your publisher, or you'll never eat in this town again. Maybe 90% of that's true. 10% of the time it's bullshit. I broke every rule.
Yeah.
And I'm doing pretty well for a mid-list author. I've never written a bestseller, but I have never thought I would be doing okay as an author.
You've been nominated for the Hugo Award.
I won the Hugo.
And you won the Hugo as well. Yeah,
I've been nominated. I've been nominated. Okay, here's the
that beats any
self-pimping
bestseller
stuff.
in my opinion for sci-fi fans. Yeah.
I don't know. Have you read all the Hugo winners? Some of them aren't that great.
Yes, I have. I can share some, but they might not like it. So.
But I've won something like 20 awards in 12 different jurisdictions. I'm available in 21 languages. I've been nominated for like over 50 awards. I've been in 30 different best of year collections. I've done okay. I am financially comfortable. I'm not rich, but I'm more secure than somebody with my talent and my output has any right to expect. And so that, the only advice I could give is probably don't pay too much attention to other people's advice.
Yeah.
And also don't have kids.
Don't have kids?
Yeah. Huge fucking carbon footprint. You can fly back and forth across the Atlantic every week of the year and still not even have half the carbon impact that you would have from producing one of those little pork rind sniffing Xbox playing unproductive parasitic mouths.
Man.
Seriously, there's stats out there that show, you know, you can go meat free, you can use recyclables, you can give up a car. These all produce little bubbles of carbon savings that are the size of an asteroid or Mars or the moon. You give up having a child, that's a disk the size of the fucking sun. That's just science, folks.
Wow.
What was that poem? Man passes misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself.
Wow.
That's a quote. I don't know where it's from, but it's a good line.
I guess on that note, it was a sincere pleasure, Peter. It's always fun. There's never a dull moment when we catch up. But thank you so much for sharing, your life, sharing the ups and the downs in your life, giving advice to folks, sharing about your writing, and also the climate, which, I do want to end by saying that is a big issue. And I understand that folks, there are plenty of folks that deny it, or they may not, there's a lot of noise out there, but at the same time, we should have people who are speaking out about it every single time, right? There's that saying, right? Like, for evil to succeed, good men don't do anything, or something along those lines.
Yeah, for all that's necessary for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing. But
exactly.
Which begs the question, if you do nothing, what makes you any fucking good?
Yeah, that is true as well. So, in classic Peter Watts, fashion, we'll sign off here. And thanks again, Peter.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
All right, cool. Hi. If you like the podcast, head over to our exclusive insight section, where our guests will dive deeper on actionable insights that can help transform your life.